Well, as I said, tonight we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 as we continue in our devotional on suffering. Just to sort of recap and remind you of where we've been in our study so far, we talked about the meaning of suffering and really started talking about the topic of suffering, and we looked at Job chapter 5 and his interaction with God. We looked a little bit of that. Last week, we looked at how Christ is our example in suffering. We looked at Hebrews chapter 5 as it reminded us how he is the ultimate example for us in all that we face and all that we do in life, and especially in our suffering. And tonight, we're going to look at God's grace for our suffering, and how he provides grace for us when we are in the midst of our suffering. Tonight I wanted to start off by sharing with you something that the great preacher Vance Havner shared once. He said at the Nicene Council, now the Nicene Council was a council back in 318 AD, so it was, golly, I guess this year had been 1700 years ago, okay? So in the 4th century, there was this really important church meeting. This was one of the meetings where they finalized the Christian church's beliefs in Christ and working on the canon of the Bible and all of these things. This is some of those meetings. But at the Council of Nicaea, it says that, or this was during the 4th century, it says that of the 318 delegates that attended, less than 12, less than 12 had not lost an eye, a hand, or did not limp on a leg lame by torture for their Christian faith. So over 300 of these delegates had either lost an eye or a hand or had a noticeable limp because of their torture, because of their Christian faith. More than likely at the hands of the Romans, more so than probably anyone else. But with the Roman Empire having a wide breadth of control at that time, they had state-sanctioned persecution of the church in those early days. And so in the 4th century, during that time, it was a matter of a great time of persecution. And so these guys really did know what it meant to suffer for Jesus. That some had lost eyes and limbs and were even permanently handicapped because of it, as we would know it to be. And so they would have a really firm understanding of what it meant to experience God's grace in their suffering. They knew exactly what that meant. They knew exactly what it meant to have the grace that is sufficient for everything that we face to help them endure the difficult days of their persecution. And so tonight, as we get started, let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. It's verse 9, as I've said, and I'm reading from the New King James Version tonight. And it says, and he said to me, this is Paul writing and talking about Jesus, okay? So this is Paul talking about Jesus. Paul says, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And so what we see here is that, he says that Christ has told him that Christ will give him grace that is sufficient, more than enough. Not just enough, but sufficient, more than enough. And that not only that, that through Paul's weakness, the power of God, the strength of God is shown to be made perfect. That his power is perfectly supplied in our life when we are at our weakest. And, Paul goes on and says, that he would gladly boast in his infirmities so that the power of God would rest on him. So that he would receive the power of God. He would gladly talk about how weak a person he was so that the power of God would work in him and through him and would help him in his suffering, as we're looking at this point. Now, this devotional starts off with a sentence with just a handful of words that will seem completely ludicrous to us when we first hear these words. Because when I read back through this devotion earlier today, I had to stop. I did a double take and a triple take and had to reread that sentence a couple times to make sure that I hadn't written it down wrong out of the book that we get this from. But here's what it says. It says, when faced with adversity, or suffering, whatever you want to call it, when faced with adversity, do not try to deny it or avoid it. And I looked at that and I thought, wait a minute, I must have misread that. And so, like I said, I read it a couple times, so I'm going to read it again. When faced with adversity, do not try to deny it or avoid it. Now, it's sort of like, for me, the way I sort of think about this is, it says, when faced with adversity, don't try to deny it or avoid it. Now, last night, Cooper was playing in a basketball game, and I'm helping coach, and so I'm on the sidelines. And the only places for spectators to sit were under the baskets on either end over at Hudson Recreation Center. And Misty and my dad and Drew were sitting under the basket there, almost right behind the basket. And this one errant pass gets thrown, and it gets away from somebody, or somebody kicks it off their knee or whatever, and the ball goes shooting towards this empty set of bleachers right beside where Misty and Dad and Drew are sitting. Well, Misty's natural response, because it was relatively close to her, was the same response that most of us would have. And what is that? To sort of throw your hands up, to sort of defend yourself, or to get away. It's sort of like a foul ball in the stands at a softball game or a baseball game. You're naturally going to throw your hands up sort of as a reflex, or you're going to flinch to sort of try and protect yourself. Well, when we come to a time of suffering, when we come to a time of adversity, what is going to be our natural, notice I said not spiritual, but our natural response? Our natural response is going to be to sort of flinch, to try and avoid it, to try and deny it, to try and get away from it. And so naturally, in our natural human mentality, that's what we're going to try and do. We're naturally going to try and get away from those that suffering or that adversity or whatever that is coming at us or is causing problems for us. But in the spiritual side of things, we ought to follow the words of this devotional and not try to deny it, not try to avoid it. And we'll see why. See, the real solution seems almost the opposite from what you might naturally think of doing. The opposite is to allow things to move forward as the Lord wills, so that His grace can be sufficient in that situation. See, at the time that the Apostle Paul wrote 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he carried with him some sort of an affliction. There's a lot of speculation as to what that thorn in the flesh was that Paul had. Some believe that it was poor eyesight. Some believe it was some other physical infirmity, such as a limp or something like that. Some think it's any number of things. It could have been an actual person that was a constant, thorn in the flesh to him. We don't really know. And when it's sort of like my mom told me one time, we got all these questions about things we read in the Bible and why things work out the way they do on earth and stuff. And when we can get the answer, it probably ain't really going to matter. We're going to be in heaven, and it really ain't going to matter what the answer is anyway. So regardless of what Paul's thorn in the flesh was, regardless of what that affliction was, we know that it was more than likely some sort of physical illness. There was some sort of physical problem that he had. But what we see is that through the Scriptures, Paul asked repeatedly for relief from this. He repeatedly prayed to God, and we see that he prayed 3 times, asking God for help. And God did not take away Paul's suffering. Paul was trying to do what we were just talking about. He was trying to deny that suffering. He was trying to deny that thorn in the flesh. He was trying to do all he could to avoid it. So he asked God, please take this away from me. He asked several times. However, what we do see is that God did give Paul the key to comfort even while facing this great adversity, whatever his problem was. What you could do is, if you wanted to, you could insert when I say Paul's affliction or Paul's adversity, or I use the term suffering tonight, Choose that adversity that you face in your life, whether it's health issues, whether it's family issues, whether it's whatever. It could be co-workers, it could be any number of things. Regardless of what it is, you could insert that there and think about the statement that I just said. God just gave, insert your name, Paul, the key to comfort even while facing great whatever, adversity. Whatever your problem is, whatever your suffering is, whatever your adversity is. God has given us the key to it. Regardless of what it is. You can insert your name and you can insert any hypothetical or real problem or situation that you want to into this devotional as we're seeing tonight. God gave him the key, because what God taught Paul was to be thankful in his situation for his own weakness, so that he could rely, so that he could depend on God's perfect strength and provision. Because see, part of that is, if Paul was able to get himself out of it, why does he need God? Much less God's grace. Why does he need God's strength? Why does he need God's provision? He doesn't if he can get himself out of it. And if God just miraculously, in a moment, fixes whatever Paul's problem is, if God were to do that, would Paul be as close to God as he was? Would Paul have as much dependence and need to rely on God? No, he wouldn't. And I'm not saying that God just dangles the suffering there on top of us, or dangles it there in front of us just to keep us close to him, just so we have to rely on him. I'm not saying that he does that. But in God's will and in his plan and in his perfection, God is able to give us that perfect strength. He's able to give us that provision so that we are able to rely on him when we are at our weakest. Because when we are weak, he is strong. And so it's important that we understand that it's not about what we can do in and of ourselves. And it's not even about us. That's hard for us. It's hard for us to get outside of our heads sometimes and realize, but it's not even about me. It's not even about you. It's not about us. It's all about him. And so when we're suffering, it's about how he is going to be glorified through our suffering, and how he is going to make his strength perfect in our weakness, and how he is going to work through that to bring glory to his name, to show the glory of the kingdom of God, and how he is going to work through all of that. See, we can depend on God's truth as we read it here in the Bible, because God will be with us in the middle of our suffering. It's not that he just leaves us to our own devices just because we're hurting, or just because our heart aches, or because we are physically exhausted or physically sick or anything like that. God doesn't leave us to our own, figure it out yourself type mentality. He doesn't do that to us. Now, here recently, me and my wife have had to teach our sons that mom and dad are not going to always be around to solve every last little thing that they need to learn how to do. I call it preparations for adulthood. Misty calls it no longer babying them, I think. But there's been times here lately, the little catchphrase in our house right now is, figure it out. Figure it out. Cooper come to me. What was it, Cooper? He come to me the other day, and he pulled out a to-go box out of the refrigerator from somewhere we had eaten earlier in the week, and he said, "Are these the fries from where it was?" And I looked at him. I'm sitting at the table, and I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking, he didn't open the box. He ain't looked inside of it. Nothing. And I just looked at him, and I said, Cooper, figure it out. And he said, like it was a big deal. And turned around and set it on the stove and then opened it up. And I'm like, are you serious? I was like, figure it out. Well, the beauty of our relationship with God is he doesn't look at us and just say, figure it out when it comes to our suffering. Or when we're facing some time of adversity. Or our health is poor. Or this or that or the other. Insert that thing that you've been inserting all night. God doesn't say, figure it out. No, instead he says, rely on me. Depend on me. Let me give you the grace for it. And I'll tell you, that is something that, and with the exception of Amy. The rest of you are older than I am. Some of you may be able to say, you know what, that is the way it works out. The older we get, the more we understand that God's grace truly is sufficient for the things that we face in this life. And that's something that I am continually continually being reminded of. Really the recent year and a half or close to 2 years that our family has endured has just been, it's been hard. Our boys have had a hard time losing loved ones. It's just, and they're still struggling with it. We had one the other night that was still upset, and we were still working through some stuff with them. But here recently, my dad gets this cancer diagnosis, and I was sitting today with Rick Krause and his son Ashley, and we were eating lunch together today after a thing at the Caldwell Baptist Association. And Rick and my dad are really close. They're really close. And we were talking or whatever, and I told Rick that after Dad shared with me what was going on, I told Rick and them, I said, my prayer has been that once I was able to sort of get past my concern for my dad, which to some degree. My prayer for myself was that God would just give me peace about it. Philippians 4:7 tells us that He has a peace that goes beyond all understanding, transcends all understanding, and that His peace basically will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And that's something that I pray over folks that have lost loved ones, that go through similar situations with their own family members. And as I prayed that, it was eerie how the Lord just brought a peace to my heart about this situation. And since then, I've known for weeks, and I haven't been able to say anything to anybody until here recently. But for weeks now, I've had this peace about this situation. And my dad's cancer is treatable. It's just a matter of figuring out what kind of treatment to go with, but it's still very serious. But as I was talking with Rick and Ashley today at lunch, I told them, I said, I was telling them about this prayer for peace during this situation. And I told them, I said, because I realize that even if what I want to happen through all of this doesn't happen, God's grace is going to be sufficient for whatever Dad faces. Regardless of what we face, God's grace is going to be sufficient. And, as I prepared for this a few days ago, and then talked with Rick and Ashley today, and then read through these notes this afternoon again, I was just reminded that that's what it is, that as we get to those points in our life where it's not in our control. The only thing we can do is respond to it spiritually. It's our responsibility to make sure that we, in and of ourselves, rely on God to bring that peace, and then to give us a good dose of grace in the middle of what we're facing. And that even if things don't turn out like we want, even if our health doesn't improve, even if this situation doesn't change, even if we remain weak, as Paul puts it, even if we remain weak, God is still being He's still being glorified through that perfect strength that is shown manifest in our lives. And so that grace is going to continue to abound in our lives so that we can receive that grace from Him, and so that we can endure that time of suffering and adversity. It may be for a year and a half, 2 years. It may be for 20 years. We don't know. But what we do know is that God's grace is going to be sufficient. See, God will be with us in the middle of our suffering, regardless of what it is, whether it's the loss of a loved one, some difficult health situation, or some chronic health problem, or whatever it is. God is going to be in the middle of that suffering with us, and He will give us the grace that we need to bear even the most unbearable situations. We think at certain times, we think, I don't know how I'll ever make it through this. This is just, Lord, this is unbearable. And I'll be honest with you, when I love the way my dad is. My dad, he comes out to the truck. I pulled up. I was at his house by myself. I didn't have the boys with me. I pulled up, and Dad flags me down. He's like, "Hey, I need to talk to you for a second." I said, "Okay." So he walks up to the side of my truck, and that's when he's like, "Oh yeah, by the way, this is what's going on." And I'm like, "Seriously? This is just just the most random conversation sitting in my truck, And he's telling me about his cancer and stuff. But even in the midst of all of that, we think about how you know, we see these sort of things, and, you know, Dad tells me about this situation, and I'm starting to think about this, how I'm going to pray through this. And my first prayer was, Lord, we need a win. We need a win in this situation. I said, we've had a tough time. It's been a long year and a half, 2 years. And I said, Lord, we need a win. We need something that our family just needs a win. And as things continued, to us it seemed like another unbearable circumstance. But even in the midst of that, God gives us the grace to bear up under it. And I'm going to close with this tonight. It says in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, it says, "And God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work." And so God is going to, as it says there, God is able to make all grace abound towards us. God is able to make all His grace available to us, if you want to look at it from that regard. So that even in the most difficult of times, as He says there, we're always having all sufficiency in all things, meaning that He is going to be more than sufficient for us in all that we face. And so the good thing that we have, or one of the good things that we have because of our relationship with Christ, is that God is able to give us His grace during our times of suffering. And that makes it bearable for us. Does it make it easy? No. But it helps us to endure because we're relying on Him rather than relying on ourselves or our strength or our family or whoever it may be. When we rely on Him, He gives us perfect strength. Everything else is fallible. Everything else can let us down. Everyone else can let us down. But we know that He won't. We know that He can provide, we know that He will, and we know that He will help us through it all.